I have to say, I am absolutely not surprised in any way that as the NFL has been putting out these different positional listings for the top 100 team, the all-time NFL 100 team, that some of these analytics nerds and some younger fans in particular seem to have this great problem with the representation of players from previous eras being so heavily represented on these all-time lists. I am totally not surprised. Because for some, if they didn't see it, it's like it never happened. It didn't exist. For others, it can be just as easily to dismiss those days that have gone by and focus on the belief that the athletes are always the bigger, the better, the best now than whatever could be. And there is so much context that is missing from that conversation. Look, the bottom line is, if you look at things within that type of bubble, then every 10, 15, 20 years, you're going to have to redo lists. You're going to have to. Because things change, games change, leagues change, way talents are featured change. Like if we use the mindset and the approach that is being taken by a lot of people here with the NFL list, that means that we would, in 10, 20 years, be taking Michael Jordan and LeBron James and Kobe Bryant and Hakeem Olajuwon and Shaquille O'Neal off of all-time NBA lists. Does that make any sense? Absolutely the hell not. And what so many people are forgetting is, to me, when you do lists like this and you are doing all-time lists, the number one key important measure that you must have, more than statistics, more than height, weight, speed, more than anything else, is dominance relative to peers. That's the standard. That's the measurement. You could have discussions within that, and you could say, when you look at the wide receiver position, you could say, well, Don Hudson played in an era that wasn't integrated. They didn't allow black players for pretty much his whole career. Absolutely valid point. It is absolutely valid to point that out as a part of the discussion. To say that so many great athletes that were not white were refused the ability to play in the NFL during the decade, the mid-30s to the mid-40s, in which Don Hudson played. It's also valid to say that a lot of great NFL talents during the 40s that did happen to be in the league were off fighting in the war. That also is absolutely true. Those are potentially strikes you could hold against a Don Hudson. But it is also fair to say that when you look at his numbers relative to his competition, his time, and his peers, that it puts him on the list as one of the greatest receivers of all time. You got so many people now that are focusing on the numbers, and the numbers alone, and the numbers drive the conversation. And how could a Julio Jones or a DeAndre Hopkins not be included as finalists for the wide receiver position on the all-time top 100 list? But you got all these other guys that played all these years ago that don't have nearly the numbers. Well, the numbers don't tell the whole story. It's a lot easier. And look, I'm not besmirching Julio Jones and DeAndre Hopkins. And I'm not even saying that they don't deserve consideration. Frankly, though, if you're talking about for the decade that we're in, the best receiver of this decade has been Antonio Brown from a pure statistical numbers standpoint. That can't be argued. It's Antonio Brown. I understand maybe why he wasn't put on the list because of some of the recent bullshit, but let's face it, OJ killed 2 people, and he was on the list for the running backs, and he deserved to be on there. Antonio Brown should have been in that conversation for sure. But the numbers alone can't drive the argument. Because the numbers that Julio Jones and DeAndre Hopkins put up are impressive. They're going to be in the Hall of Fame someday. But just because their numbers have larger volume doesn't automatically make them better. For example, if Julio Jones goes through a full season with, let's say, 90 catches, 14 to 1,500 yards, and 6 touchdowns, well, that sounds great in theory. And it is great by any standard. But if you're talking about his quarterback threw for almost 5,000 yards and threw for 30-something touchdowns, whereas a guy like Jerry Rice, I'm talking about the GOAT of wide receivers here, obviously, but in his era, Montana might have thrown for 3,500 yards in the season, and Jerry Rice had 1,500 of them, and Joe Montana might have thrown for 25 or 30 touchdowns, and Rice had 15 of them. Based off of the percentage of utilization in the offense and so forth, Jerry Rice's numbers are more dominant compared to a Julio Jones. You have to measure these guys based off of the eras that they're in. Just because you didn't see somebody play doesn't mean that they weren't great. Just because they don't put up the same quantities of numbers as certain guys doesn't mean that they don't belong in the conversation. They don't belong in the list. Because when you look, let's say, at Don Hudson, if he has a season of 14 touchdown receptions, but his quarterback, whether it be Herbert or Isbell going back in the day, if they only threw 20 of them, well, he's catching 3/4 of his team's touchdowns. He's catching 3/4 of his team's passes. He's gaining 3/4 or 4/5 of his team's total yards. You can't just dismiss that from the conversation. It's like this whole prevalent belief that the athletes are automatically bigger, stronger, faster, so that automatically makes them better. Well, one, that's been a natural evolution as sports science has improved, nutrition has improved, weight training has been more implemented, strength training has been given a larger emphasis, focusing on speed and quickness and explosiveness. The game has changed. Times have changed. That is true. It's also true to say you could question and wonder how much better guys from 50, 60, 70, 80 years ago would have been able to play, and how much better athletes they would have been if they would have had some of the same perks and advantages that guys have now. It's like when you talk about a Jim Brown. Jim Brown played in an era where he was bigger than most of the offensive and defensive linemen, and that's absolutely true. It doesn't automatically take away from his greatness. It doesn't change that fact. But if you took Jim Brown and you put him in today's era, he would still dominate. I firmly believe that. If you took Walter Payton from his time and put him in this time, he most certainly would dominate. Just because they played a long time ago, just because you didn't see them play, doesn't automatically mean that they couldn't play in today's game. And it also doesn't mean that these guys that play now would go back in time 60 years and put up the same type of numbers or even better. I saw some clown trying to say, well, what happened if you took Michael Thomas and put him back in the 40s? Well, number one, Michael Thomas wouldn't even have been given the opportunity to play in the NFL until 46. So would he have set records in the 40s with only 4 years of the decade to play in? Probably not. Furthermore, you have to look at the times with which he would have played in and say, how would he have been utilized? How often would he have been taken advantage of in the passing game? How different would it have been if you took other guys and put him back in that era that would have been able to be physical with him and been able to chuck with him all the way up and down the field and not just in the first 5 yards? Again, the context matters. Just because you don't have the sack numbers to quantify because the statistic didn't exist doesn't mean that guys like Deacon Jones and Geno Marchetti weren't all-time great players. Or that a Bob Lilly or a Merlin Olsen weren't all-time great defensive tackles. You have to look at the dominance relative to the time with which they played in. And you cannot sit there and look at such a recent bubble of the past 20 years or 25 to 30 years or so and only draw the greatest players ever out of that list. And if we want to sit there and have this illusion that great athletes only became a thing in the NFL the past 20, 25 years, I ask you this. Who's the fastest player in NFL history? And you'll hear answers. Deion Sanders, Randy Moss, Darrell Green. And all three are on the all-time list in terms of speed. Darrell Green had world-class speed back in his college days at Texas A&M Kingsville. Randy Moss had phenomenal speed. Deion Sanders, great speed. The fastest player in NFL history, it's a verifiable, documentable fact, is 1964 Olympic gold medalist in the 100 meters and in the 4x1 bullet Bob Hayes. And he played in the 60s and the early 70s. If you took Bob Hayes in his time and put him in today's time where the freaking receiver position is utilized way more, corners couldn't be as physical with him, how great could Bob Hayes have been? Like, you can have this conversation going both ways. Like, if you say, oh, slinging Sammy Ball, look at his numbers. His numbers alone in a vacuum, when comparing it throughout history as the game has changed, the league has changed, is not an effective measure. What is an effective measure for Sammy Ball is his dominance as a passer relative to his peers, combined with the fact that he also had the responsibility of playing as a defensive halfback, and he was also the premier punter of his damn time. Whereas players today can specialize in one thing and in one area, and they have all this technology available, and they have all these analytics available, and all this film study that they could do. These guys were lucky to be able to watch any film, and if they were watching it on old reels, and who knows what the hell the quality. It sure as hell didn't have all 22s. Should Sammy Baugh be considered any less great of a player because he didn't have a bunch of 4,000-yard passing seasons? If anything, it should elevate his greatness that in his time, he was arguably the best at 3 different positions in football. 3 different positions. It's like all of a sudden, if you looked at Bruce Smith and Reggie White, all-time great defensive ends. But if all of a sudden you took and you said, okay, we're going to put this guy in a modern system, and all he literally ever does is rush the passer, and he gets 20-something sacks every season because that's his only responsibility. That's all he ever does, no matter what. Screw it. He could end his career with 300 sacks. It doesn't make him a better player than Reggie White or Bruce Smith just because the numbers say that he's better. That's dumb. What I'm trying to say here is, it is true in some of these cases that some modern players deserve to be considered as finalists and potentially be put on the list. I don't believe Joe Thomas was included on the list of offensive tackles, and he should have been. And he should have been in the top 100. It is not fair to me to say somebody like an Antonio Brown, who was statistically the best receiver of his time, of his decade, wasn't even listed as a finalist for the top 100 at the wide receiver position. But you'll see people talking about, oh, John Stallworth doesn't deserve it, or Pete Pihos doesn't deserve it. Why? Because you didn't see them? Why? Because they don't have the same numbers? Again, the numbers aren't fair. You have to compare the numbers relative to competition. Now, if you wanted to say that guys like Antonio Brown were more dominant in their time compared to John Stallworth in his time, even though utilization rates were different, never mind the fact he was sharing the ball with Lynn Swann at the wide receiver position and so forth. It is a fair argument. You could certainly make the case because it's true. Antonio Brown was more dominant for a longer period of time in his time than a John Stallworth was. Absolutely true. 100% align. 100% agree. But it also doesn't mean that we should take guys like a Don Hudson off of the list or a Paul Warfield off of the list. The game was different back then. You know, you didn't have as many dink and dunk 3- and 5-yard passes. When you threw the ball down the field. You threw the ball to make big plays happen. You threw the ball when you had to. So guys like Warfield might only have 25 or 30 catches in a season, but they might get 8 touchdowns. They might average 25 yards of reception. Like, the league changes. The game is different. But what we can't be doing is just being so caught up in our recency bias that we dismiss everything that happened in the NFL before 1980. Newsflash, people. Great players existed in the NFL before you were born. And just because you didn't watch them, just because the numbers don't equate from different eras, that doesn't diminish their greatness. In order to have a truly all-encompassing top 100 list, you must have representation from all eras, not just the eras that you saw.